Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak at your network. I'm really excited to join you. I think the format that you have here is absolutely brilliant. To have individual groups in different places that are talking together and trying to address, in this case, a really important issue. It's an issue that I've been working on for many years, and I'm going to share some of my research with you over the next half hour or so, maybe a little bit less, give time to get some feedback and discussion as well. And I'm going to share some of the conclusions I've reached through that research as well. So the way in which I'm going to structure my talk is to talk about a couple of individual bits of research that I've done over the years that are related to awarding gaps or outcome gaps based on socioeconomic differences. And then what I want to do in the second half of the talk is think about why, as a sector, we haven't changed as much as we might have done. In other words, what are the drivers that make us continue doing the same thing rather than taking maybe a more research-informed approach to the kind of work that we do? The paper that I'm going to start with is talk about some research that I actually did around 10 years ago now, but I think much of it is still relevant. So what I was interested in here is awarding gaps or other kinds of outcome gaps as potentially a result of what I call transition gaps. In other words, I wanted to know whether the way in which students from different kinds of backgrounds transition into higher education actually affects them further down the line. And if there are gaps in transition, whether those gaps manifest then in outcome gaps and awarding gaps. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the methodology here. So I got 280 undergraduate students, 70 from each group. These are the four groups. I just called A, B, C, and D. The first group was a group of intervention WP students. So these are students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. We defined WP in terms of the way that the host university, Russell Group University, defined WP. So they had to be first generation. They had to be from a background with a household income under £25,000. The intervention was key because intervention in this case was an access program that ran during the summer, and we wanted to see whether the intervention program made a difference to the transition. So that was the first group, intervention WP students. We also looked at non-intervention WP students from the same background, but who hadn't done the access program. We then looked at two groups of non-WP students, one from state schools and one who were privately educated from independent schools. And they're very broad brush categories. So I realize there are some state schools that are very high performing. I realize there's an issue around grammar schools and where they sit within such a kind of simplistic binary. But we just wanted to get a broad sense of how, in general, young people from different backgrounds navigated their way into university. We didn't look at mature students. We didn't look at part-timers, distant learners. If you'd done a foundation year, you didn't qualify because we wanted to have as many controls in as possible. And possibly the major control is all of the participants belong to a local domicile. So they were all home students, defined as home students from within 10 miles of the university itself. That's because the intervention was only open to local students, but we thought we controlled for that with the other students as well. So what we did is an interview with each of these students, and we asked them in detail how their transition had gone and how they felt academically, and also whether they felt a kind of sense of belonging where they were. I'm going to present the kind of two extremes first. So for independent school students, there was a sense of transition being quite straightforward in many cases. And I'm going to try and give you as many quotes as possible here from the students. I apologize for reading out what you can already see. But I think it's important to try to hear the voices of the different students here. But a student we interviewed said, yeah, I feel at home here. It's not that different from school, really, or at least you know what it'd be like because they've been telling you, getting you ready for it, you know. And one thing that we found very regularly across the research that we did was that independent schools did a much better job of explaining to students what the transition would be like and what university would be like. It was interesting to talk to independent school students about their strategy as well. And often they said things like, well, what I want to do is all on the network side, join the clubs, join the societies, build a CV. I'm hoping the academic side will look after itself. So there was a real difference in the way that university was conceptualized by students from maybe better off backgrounds, and they saw it more as an opportunity to develop their social capital rather than as an academic step, which might be slightly intimidating. And there was an interesting way that we found in many of these interviews. We did a thematic analysis. A lot of independent school students talked about how comfortable they were interacting with lecturers, which I'll come back to later on, but I do think it's a really important thing. So one student said to us, they're probably sick of me all the times I'm knocking on their door asking questions. He's talking about the lecturers and he's talking about feeling confident approaching the lecturers. Whereas some of the students we spoke to who were WP students actually said the opposite. They said, well, I know my lecturers have got office hours, but actually I find it a bit intimidating. I'm not sure how I'd feel about turning up and just knocking on someone's door and having a chat with them. I think that would make me feel very uncomfortable. Non-intervention WP students, they were the ones who in some ways found the transition most difficult. One of them said, no, I found it hard to adjust, to be honest. It was a big jump. My first year marks were great. I didn't understand what I was supposed to be doing. And that was a recurring theme, really. A lot of students said things like, you're on your own, really. No one checks on you. You have to email someone. I'm not really like that. I'm the first person in my family going to university. So am I supposed to email about this? Do my classmates know already? So what we found is a kind of interface between personal insecurity and procedural or structural alienation. So the students were told what to do, but the way the system had been designed for these less well-off students didn't really sit easily with their dispositions or their social skills that they had. And a few students said that they'd only seen university on the television and really expressed a significant sense of not being able to navigate what was going on. And I should say all of these students got more or less similar A-level results. We were able to control for that because the university had a relatively high entry level across the board. So it's not like the students who struggled as a result of being academically inferior or inferior in terms of their qualifications, I mean, rather than, so it's really the differences were due to their actual experiences. The intervention I mentioned earlier, so one of the hypotheses I wanted to look at in this paper was to see whether intervention programs made a difference and how they made a difference. And I still tend to think this is quite an under-researched area. One student said the intervention helped. I stayed mates with a few of the people on the course, people I met on the course. That's good because then when you arrive, it's not like you're totally on your own. Again, a big focus on social capital as a means to gain the academic confidence, and that was the route for many students. Another student said, well, without knowing what I knew about the campus from the intervention program, it'd been way different. Those first few lectures, those first few weeks, I'd have just been, and the student shrugged, unable to articulate how difficult he would have found it. And interestingly, a number of students, particularly those who'd done the intervention, said, well, the assessment wasn't the biggest problem for me. I figured that out okay. It was more knowing how to fit in, how not to stand out, and the intervention made a big difference there. So the students who'd been on the intervention had done a good job of kind of absorbing the hidden rules of the campus. They knew where to get coffee, how to engage with the library. They didn't have panic attacks when they were talking to lecturers. They got used to the kind of the statues and the kind of paraphernalia of the university. They felt more at home in the campus. So in other words, what I've found from this particular piece of research was students don't arrive at university a blank slate. We're very focused on prior academic achievement when we generate the statistics, but actually academic achievement is not really a great proxy for where those students are at, and students got their own complex set of dispositions, their own backgrounds. We found that expectations of university and what it will be like definitely shape experiences, and we found that the gap between expectation and experience is much wider amongst WP students. So for them, it's a bigger jump, and often that jump puts them on the back foot and is maybe partly responsible for the awarding gaps that arise later on, because the experiences they have at university, which are shaped partly by their expectations, by their transition, those experiences shape the awarding gaps that emerge later. And in terms of the intervention programs, I think an important finding was that the capitals accumulated, to use Borgesian terms, during these intervention programs were most definitely social and cultural capitals as well as academic capitals. So even though the intervention had an academic element, you worked with a lecturer, you had to submit an essay, you worked with the lecturer on the essay was marked, you got feedback. I think on the first version, you had to resubmit it, and if you passed it, I think you got a 1 grade drop on your entry, on the offer that was made to you by the university. So there was an important academic element, but what students got out of the intervention was more about the social and cultural side. And maybe that is part of the reason why when we think about outcome gaps or awarding gaps, we don't always come to the right conclusions because we see them more as academic. But having said all that, I don't think any of this will really be new to you. So I published this research in, 2017. There's a lot of other research which draws similar conclusions. So for some students, the university campus is a natural extension of their previous learning environments. And for other students, it's a massive jump, and a jump that they're not able to necessarily undertake with any confidence or successfully. And that's what shapes what happens afterwards. So what I want to really think about for the main part of my talk this morning is this question: what is it that stops us doing things differently? In other words, why do we carry on with the same kind of teaching and assessment patterns, the same kind of cultures within the university, the same kind of structures, when actually there's quite a lot of research evidence from different fields, including biosciences, including educational fields and social sciences, that tells us what we do doesn't work. And I would say, although the awarding gap overall seems to have maybe dropped in some ways in some areas at some universities, it's still very disappointing that 2 students who arrive at university with the same level of prior academic attainment actually end up graduating with quite different outcomes. So I'm going to give you 6 provocations, and I'm calling them provocations rather than explanations because you might not agree with all of them, and that's absolutely fine. And I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on each of these. So 1, I'm going to make the argument that the way we think about teaching, and particularly this idea of teaching excellence, which has dominated the discourse in recent years, might not be helpful. It might be part of the problem that we're seeing teaching through the wrong lens. Secondly, I'm going to argue that the marketization of higher education in different ways has maybe made the problem worse. So as we've moved towards higher fees, towards a lot more focus on metrics, towards league tables, all of these things I'm going to suggest may have compounded the problem we have with awarding gaps. I'm going to argue that despite our best intentions as members of staff, we're probably in denial about the severe financial pressures that our students face, which is again a structural issue. And I'm going to talk about various things to do with part-time jobs and maintenance loans. I'm going to suggest that we cling stubbornly to inappropriate assessment methods. We kind of know that some assessment methods have lower differentials in terms of awarding gaps than others. And again, there's lots of research here, but we also have a sense, I would suggest, that the best way to assess our students is more or less the way we were assessed ourselves when we went to universities. But I think our students are different. We've expanded, and they probably weren't great assessment methods anyway. Fifthly, I'm going to argue that we live in an elitist society, and a lot of the ways in which university have talked about are very elitist. But then just in case you think that gets us off the hook, my final provocation is that we actually reproduce a lot of that elitism within our universities. So as I say, these are provocations, and you might not agree with all of them or any of them, and that's fine. But I think we need to move from the level of just looking at helpful hints to try and get equal outcomes, because they've been there for a long time. And we maybe need to push this a little bit higher and think about the broader cultural conditions in which higher education operates and look for clues there to see why we haven't made the progress that we'd all want to make. Okay, so I'm arguing that the way we think about teaching excellence is unhelpful, and I could have picked different discourses here, but you'll all be familiar with the kind of excellence discourse with the competitions like the Teaching Excellence Framework, but also with most universities boasting about being excellent in terms of teaching, a lot of internal teaching and learning policy being driven by this idea of excellence. But there are problems with excellence, and there's a professor at Lancaster University called Paul Ashwin who writes about this quite a lot, and I've written about it as well. Excellence doesn't really acknowledge context. So once we start talking about teaching excellence, I feel as though to some extent we're denying the context in which that teaching is taking place. We're denying the fact that students learn differently. There are different kinds of students, differentials in terms of discipline, differentials in terms of what students need to learn. So excellence is perhaps unhelpful because it pretends that there is such a thing kind of ontologically as teaching excellence, and if we were just able to achieve it, then all students would respond in the same way. And excellence therefore misunderstands the learning process, and the learning process, almost all of the pedagogical literature would suggest, isn't immediate. Students don't learn things overnight. Students sometimes struggle at first, and that undermines the idea that we can just do surveys to find out how good our teaching is, as soon as a lecture's ended or while students are still learning. Probably the process takes much longer and we need something much more long-term. Excellence, of course, implies that the effects of teaching can be neatly captured and graded. The idea of silver, gold, and bronze. The idea that we can rank teaching excellence in a very neat way, I think is probably misleading and maybe makes us think as though if we just did a little bit better, we'd be able to solve problems. Excellence is also individualistic, or at least it is in the way that we tend to talk about it with higher education. It's usually individual members of staff who win awards for their excellence, although there are team awards sometimes. It's usually about individual universities. We don't really talk about excellence as a kind of sector goal, and therefore it probably fits into this notion of normalizing competition within the sector. Obviously, if you've got universities competing against each other for different levels of TEF recognition, then inherently there's an element of competition there. It's interesting to go back to the data and see what some of the students said about these kind of things. For the students who are WP students, one said, well, I like the big lectures, and talked about how he enjoyed sitting in a room with 200 people and a lecturer at the front, but then made the point, knowing how to turn that into good marks, no idea. So this was really a kind of learning process issue for the student. The student was perfectly happy to learn and to be exposed to knowledge from someone at the front of the room. The traditional lecture worked well for them, but what they didn't know was how to translate that into performance. Another student said, well, at college, there were teachers whose job it was to make sure you stayed on track. They knew who you were and what you were like. And we had a lot of talk from students, particularly WP students, who would say there were people at their previous levels who got to know them, who knew the things they were good at and the things they weren't so good at, who could give them a nudge where necessary, and they miss that kind of support in higher education. Even if they were allocated a personal tutor or an academic advisor, they didn't feel the model worked the same way. A state school student said to us, I don't mind the idea of independent learning. I think I've always been an independent learner, but some of the rules you have to work out for yourself. And constantly in the interviews, there was a sense of unwritten rules of how you engage with the teaching that were actually as important as the teaching itself. We're asking our students to grade and measure how good the teaching is, but we don't really find out what that teaching, how that teaching impacts on them and what that teaching leads to. And an independent school student said the teaching's hit and miss. Sometimes you know how it links, mostly you don't. But what's interesting here is these four examples that I've given you are from students from different backgrounds, each of the four categories, and they all say the same thing, which is they like the teaching, they often like their teachers, which is why in the NSS they'll vote positively, but they struggle to make that connection between the things that they're taught and the way they actually perform in their assessment. Let me just talk briefly about the marketization of higher education. If you go back to when the market in higher education was introduced, there was a real attack on teaching. It was one of the big drivers for the introduction of fees, for the introduction of league tables. So David Willett, who was Secretary of State at the time, said teaching has been by far the weakest aspect of higher education. Joe Johnson, who took over from him, said lamentable teaching must be driven out of our system. And you'll be aware of all the media discourses that attack universities and attack teaching. Too many universities teach pointless degrees, offer nothing, whatever, all of these attacks. And one of the things I look at in my research is not just how the market has changed universities in terms of making students fee payers, but also how the market has maybe changed the way we think about teaching and the way we operate as a higher education sector, and perhaps damaged our confidence, because a lot of the principles behind the market were about trying to fix problems like lamentable teaching or weak teaching. It's interesting to hear how students students kind of maybe incorporate some of this in some of the things they said. There was a big focus on the financialization of higher education. One student said to us, with the new fees and everything, you want to make sure you're getting the best degree you possibly can. A friend of mine's sister got lower second and she was devastated. We saw a lot of students. This research was undertaken just after fees were trebled in 2012, so the students were on the higher fee level. They felt under pressure. They felt as though because they were paying so much for their degree, albeit that there was write-offs of debt and other things that are available, some of them had got grants, they felt under a lot more pressure than previous cohorts. How that turns into relates to their relationship with teaching is interesting. A state school student said, I wanted a uni that does okay in the league tables, but it depends a lot on which department you're in and which teachers you get put with. And just because they say we're great at teaching doesn't mean you personally will get great teaching. And I think probably we can all identify with this tendency for universities to talk a good one when it comes to teaching, to paint their campus gold if they're lucky enough to get TEF gold, to aim their marketing at very high quality teaching, to pitch it around high quality teaching. But in practice, we often know that there are job cuts and there are shortages of staff, and not always is the teaching at that kind of level. I mentioned that probably we're in denial about the financial pressures our students face. This was a piece of research that Wonky undertook last year, which I'm just going to show you to demonstrate this. They said since 2015, student numbers across the UK higher education sector have gone up by 15.5%, but the number of student hours spent in paid employment in total across that cohort has gone up by nearly 80%. And just to show you that in graph form, slightly different metric, this is just a measurement of the students in paid employment during term time. And the purple line that used to be at the top was students who didn't have any paid employment. And you can see that after a distortion because of COVID from around 2022, the two lines flipped, and now 68% of our students have got part-time jobs, only 32% don't, which is almost a complete reversal of back in 2017, 2018. The cost of living crisis is very real for students, and of course it affects our outcomes, of course it affects our awarding gaps, and unfortunately it affects them disproportionately. And I actually worry that awarding gaps might actually increase over the coming years as the cost of living crisis continues. When we talk to students, this is from a different piece of work that I did slightly more recently, published in 2020 with Katie Biggers and Diane Harris, and we were looking specifically about how students conceptualize value for money. But I just wanted to show you a couple of quotes here again to emphasize the difference in how universities experienced by different kinds of students. Russell Group student at an independent school says, I'm lucky my parents are paying the fees for me. I went to a boarding school that was 30k a year, 9k is fine, compared to a state student who is state school student I think at the same university, who says, I'm working 3 jobs right now. I don't get given hours for every one every week, so it's not so bad. Last year I had 4 jobs. My parents can't help. It's a long story. If you're familiar with the maintenance loan system that we have at English universities, you'll know there's an assumption that parents will help out even though students are over 18, and parents have no legal obligation to help out if they don't. If there's no money for the student, then the student almost certainly has to work, and not all students are eligible for full maintenance loans. A student in a million plus university put it more graphically and said, I'm in the deepest pit imaginable, and talked about the amount of debt and significantly how it affected their academic work. I'll run over the final 3 a little bit more quickly to give us time for discussion, but I do think we cling to inappropriate assessment methods. I think we're slow to change. I think it's partly because as lecturers, we can be slightly reluctant to be experimental and tend to cleave to the assessment methods through which we were assessed when we were at universities. But I also think it's a structural issue. I think universities understandably want some kind of standardization, tend to want a lot of control over assessment, and there's always a tension. And I think it's fair to say usually it's easier to not change your assessment methods than to actually try and change them, particularly if you want to change them radically. But plenty of research on this recently, including some by Maria Canal, who's I think here today, who points out written examinations along with child. Written examinations have larger gaps compared to multiple choice tests. Group work has a positive effect in reducing awarding gaps. particularly amongst final year BAME students. The evidence is out there to suggest not only which kind of assessment methods make a difference, but also why they make a difference. And if we can bring this together, then there are possibilities, I think, of significant progress. Like I say, often in this area, I feel like there's a lot of research, but also a lot of reluctance within the sector, and particularly among sector leaders and teaching leaders, to actually move forward. We live in an elitist society. I just want to mention this and give this as an example of maybe how the problem is structural and cultural as well. You might remember this headline actually crops up every summer, where the press will pick up on the idea that graduates inexplicitly outperform their A-level results with first-class degrees. So the story is, it's a grade inflation story, it's a moral panic story, but a quarter of students who achieve 3Ds of sixth form go on to get top class honours, prompting fear of grade inflation. And often you'll find people like, what was the name, Gavin Williamson, the old education minister, being absolutely horrified by this. And he'd say, we can't have universities doing this. How can universities allow students that are low achievers to do very well? I think it's worth pointing out students who are low achievers are often code for socioeconomically disadvantaged students. And I think therefore the real problem is maybe that the awarding gap is actually being closed, and that's not in the interests of everyone. I think as a sector we're timid when it comes to these kind of discourses. We tend not to push back. Whenever I see headlines like this, I always think, well, how could you fix them? Graduates outperform their A-level results with first-class degrees is actually a good news story for the sector. And if you get rid of the fears of grade inflation and maybe even replace it with go on to get top class honours, prompting lots of nice praise for universities by politicians, suddenly we can celebrate what we're doing, because actually we're very good in many areas of allowing students whose talents weren't spotted or weren't nurtured at the pre-18 level to do very well when they come to university. Finally, my argument is maybe we can't just blame society and politicians. We do reproduce elitism. I did a quick Google search the other night for English university. These are the kind of universities that crop up. They're very traditional. They're probably very colonial. They're probably very off-putting to students from backgrounds like that. We can't really do much about that. But I was also reminded when I was looking at the pictures about some of the data I got in relation to a question that I asked, which was, are you thinking about postgrad? Here's a student from an intervention WP student from a state school. I said, are you thinking about postgrad? Student said, what's that again? I said, like a master's course, maybe. Student says, I get mixed up, to be honest. Is that like when everyone has to call you doctor? I get laughed at so much for that. And I said, no, it's usually a step before that. They said, oh yeah, that's right. No, I'm not sure that'd work for me, to be honest. Compare that to an independent school student at the same time, the same project, same question. Yes, postgrad's always been the plan. Gap year to get the CV going, then hit the books again. I've just been chatting to so-and-so about what kind of course would give me the best chance for stipend. He says UCL's best for what I want to do, and he's put me in touch with someone down there. I think this kind of captures the way in which maybe sometimes all of us are guilty of talking to different kinds of students in different kinds of ways and bringing our own preconceptions, which may well be based on previous awarding gaps and notions of success, but we bring our own preconceptions and possibly prejudices to our work in terms of how we engage with different kinds of students. Obviously, it's also a measure of different levels of confidence, cultural capital, familiarity with the language, and understanding of rules of the game. I'm not going to talk about too many ways of breaking the link because I'm looking forward to hear what other people think, but assessment as a genuine development exercise rather than a ranking mechanism seems a crucial direction of travel. I think we're really wedded to the idea that we have to rank our students. We have to know who the first class students are. We're inappropriately confident of our ability to do that, and we possibly we don't draw on the idea of assessment being developmental in the way we could do. I think it would be useful more generally and for all kinds of reasons to push back the language of excellence, particularly individual excellence and the logic of competition. I don't think that's helped us at all in this attempt we're making to try to reduce awarding gaps. I think crucially within universities there needs to be more trust for on the ground academic staff to know what works for best best for their own students. I think we're seeing a lot of very high level teaching policy initiatives and directives from teaching and learning groups within universities that maybe aren't well thought through and maybe look to standardize rather than to increase trust. Many academic staff are very good at knowing what their students need, but are pulled in different directions. And finally, even amongst equal ability students, ability in scare quotes, it would be good if we could actually recognize and celebrate learning differences. And one of the ideas I've been thinking of is maybe that the ultimate goal is not that everyone has the same outcomes from universities, but we just don't care so much about those differences in outcomes because we're more interested in celebrating the different learning journeys that our students have taken. So there's some of my ideas of how that link that we're talking about this morning might be broken based on some of the research I've done. Thank you.